This unit is all about the power of positive emotions. Let's review chapter 6 together, the principles of pleasure. You want to always check those terms at the end of your chapter. I thought I would help you break down some of those here, these defining emotional terms that will help you understand the information in these chapters. Affect is our immediate physiological response. I jump for joy. That's my affect. Emotion involves some judgments and goal pursuits. So now I'm thinking about that affect, and there's some direction, there's some object of my emotion. I'm jumping for joy, I got a great present, or I'm graduating. Mood is longer lasting, so it's over hours. Emotions are fleeting, they're just seconds, but a mood is minutes and hours, maybe even days. When we talk about happiness, we think of it as a positive emotional state, and it's subjective, so it's how I describe it. Well-being is happiness, which is some positive emotional state, plus meaning. What do I think about my life? Subjective well-being is your life satisfaction. So now we have some cognitive appraisals. How do I think about how my life is going? Plus some positive emotion. When we distinguish the positive and the negative, there's been little research on affect, but there has been a measure, and you're going to take it, called the PANAS. The PANAS X has 20 items, and it measures both positive affect and negative affect scale. That's what the PANAS stands for. The relationship between positive and negative affect varies. It's not always inversely correlated. In other words, if I'm experiencing a lot of positive affect, you might think, well, that means there's no negative affect, but in fact, that's not necessarily the case. We might be experiencing both kinds of affect at the same time. We might be happy and sad. We call that bittersweet, for example. So they're not on one dimension. So the more you have of one, the less you have of the other. They're separate factors. When we talk about how do we think about our repertoire or set of pleasure, Dr. Eisen's findings on positive emotions are interesting. He found that the more positive emotions you express, you have improved problem solving and decision making. The greater your positive affect, you're more likely to take greater risk. Barbara Fredrickson has built on this with her broaden and build model of positive emotions, and the book has a nice graphic about this. It basically says the more positive emotion you experience, joy, for example, you're more open to new ideas and experiences, you have a sense of play. This also builds psychological capital and resilience for us. So the more you experience, the more positive that becomes for humans. Positive affect also influences making change. It helps us to do that better. It improves our memory and helps us build our psychological resources. And it can also offset some negative experiences. It can positively influence our mental health, and it can increase our happiness. The more just positive emotions we try to experience. When we think about age-old definitions of happiness, we can look at the great philosophers and Buddha, Aristotle, America's founding fathers, as you've examined what does happiness mean in our Declaration of Independence. Thinking about eudaimonia is an old way to think about happiness, which is human flourishing from a life of virtue. You might even say that's part of what Campbell University tries to promote, living a life with purpose, a life with meaning, leading with purpose. And it's about a virtuous life and how you will flourish as a result of that. There's three theories that you should be aware of when we think about how we might think about how people live a good life. One is need and goal satisfaction. So you satisfy your needs. This leads to your happiness because you reach your goals. You reach some accomplishments. You could think of this also as the R in the A, accomplishments in PERMA. There's process and activity theories, meaning it's engagement. It's not what you get necessarily. It's just sort of the journey. The process and engagement produce the happiness, and positive acts that paying it forward can improve happiness. A third theory, which is also true, so these all partly explain happiness, are that there's some genetic and personality predisposition theories. One is that there's this relationship between happiness and genetics. In fact, about 40% of our happiness, we seem to have a set point. So even if something really great happens or something bad happens, we kind of return to that set point, and it's different for different people. The big five personality factors, which are also predominantly genetic, also seem to be related to happiness. So extroverts tend to be happier. Those who are lower on neuroticism, another of the big five, these are two of the big five factors, people tend to be happier. When we think about determinants of subjective well-being, again, subjective well-being, we're looking at how do you think about your life and your basic needs? What about your relationships? We believe that is really important. And we know that people with hypermasculinity, meaning they are kind of really guys don't cry kind of gender stereotypes, it may reduce their expression of positive affect, which is problematic because we know that expressing more positive affect leads to greater happiness. So some 21st century definitions of happiness is that chronic happiness, if you want to call it that, is governed by three main factors. The genetic set point, and again, it looks to be about 40% of a person's happiness. The circumstances in which you're born. You didn't have any choice what country or culture or family, that's yours. So these circumstances also dictate our happiness. Again, something you don't control. But fortunately, your behavior also dictates and governs your happiness. So the activities and practices, whether we meditate or exercise, engage in positive health behaviors, these also can influence your happiness. So there are things you can do. We also know that collectivist and individualist views influence happiness. This gets back to culture and happiness. For individualistic cultures like ours in the United States, self-esteem seems to relate to happiness, whereas in collective countries or cultures, it doesn't seem to hold a relationship. Finally, when we think about what is complete mental health, this is our emotional, social, and psychological well-being. It's what it means to really flourish. And the book explains, the difference between that sort of mental illness and mental health. Emotional, social, and psychological well-being are really what we're going for. And you need a high level of each one of those and no mental illness to have this pleasurable life. Now we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about chapter 7, which is making the most of your emotional experiences. And this chapter is packed full of information about how to control that beast within when our amygdala takes over and we are not regulating our emotions very well, and how to have emotional approach or emotional avoidance to problems. So we avoid the emotions and how we feel, it can have some negative outcomes. And then talking a little bit about how do we process our emotions and express them. Well, we know that emotion-focused coping, so when we're having a challenge or difficulty, if we're able to think about the emotions and feel better about them or reframe them, it improves our medical health, increases our self-esteem and life satisfaction, and it tends to buffer us against discrimination. Emotion-focused coping shows the adaptive potential that we can reframe how we're interpreting what's happening to us. Asian cultures tend to suppress emotions, and certainly culture affects the types of beneficial coping. When we talk about emotion-focused coping, it's important to understand the benefits of this approach and that we have a behavioral activation system and some cultural differences even in our neurology, which forms the basis of our physiology for expressing emotions. What about emotional intelligence? There's a lot of information about that. Daniel Goleman made this popularize that there's this higher order of intelligence, but it really came from Salovey and Myers' 4-branch model. And the branches are first about perceiving emotions. Are you able to even tell and name how you're feeling? Are you upset? Are you happy? Branch 2 is facilitating thought, like processing, why am I feeling this way or why are others feeling that way? And then understanding those emotions. Why might a person be upset in this situation or happy? And then branch 4 is managing or regulating your own emotions and the emotions of others. The more skilled you are at these 4 branches, the better you tend to do. And we know that there are many benefits associated at work with greater emotional intelligence. So it's worth thinking a little bit about how do you rate in these different areas? And I encourage you to maybe pause the video and take a look. And how would you rate yourself, and where are some areas that you can improve? These are skills you can learn. Emotional intelligence shows positive interpersonal functioning. The higher your emotional intelligence is, it helps explain our social functioning, and it can teach others to benefit from emotional experiences. It's connected to other cognitive abilities in terms of resilience, mindfulness, leadership, and well being. Well, let's shift gears and talk about socio emotional selectivity. Uh, as we become older, we tend to recall more positive information. What we pay attention to changes. So there's better recall of positive material among older people, and more positive messages encourage helpful behavior. And in fact, Chinese older Americans, older adults, remembered fewer negative pictures. And this is despite the fact that in the US, we hold a negative view of aging. The fact is, as we get older, we remember more positive events. So thinking about what you focus on is important, and it does get better at age. Emotional storytelling is another big concept in this chapter, and James Pennebaker has done a lot of work in this area. I worked with one of his proteges when I was at University of Arizona, and they looked at how do people write about events, traumatic events that might happen to them. The person I worked with studied divorce and breakups. Emotional writing can predict health outcomes, and the more positive emotion words people use, the better health outcomes there are. Emotionally expressive writing benefits a number of people who experience trauma. For example, breast cancer survivors show increased life quality. It assists with feelings around feeling discriminated against. And we know that there's benefits and emotion approach style of coping. In terms of long-term benefits and storytelling, that's why stories are great for children, especially if they show positive emotion approaches. Now, a couple caveats. Emotional experience is not universal. There are 6, depending who you talk to, 5 to 6 universal emotions, but the expression and intensity of these vary. We might call those focal emotions. Asians are more dialectical in emotional experiences, meaning they're not all one thing or the other. They might experience several seemingly different emotions simultaneously. We do know that emotional experiences, if they really get us going, the hot cognition, hot emotions are taxing and can lead to challenges in processing our feelings. So I hope you will think about emotions, how you can work to experience more positive emotions and encourage that in others.